Our next speaker will be Eliezer Ben-Rafael. Eliezer Ben-Rafael is an Israeli sociologist. He earned his PhD in sociology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is emeritus professor at Tel Aviv University. He served as Weinberg Professor of Sociology there. He is president of the International Institute of Sociology, chair of the Israeli Association for the Study of Language. He has published on ethnicity and language in Israel, the transformation of the kibbutz, Jewish identities, an aspect of contemporary globalization. He is the editor of a Brill series in Jewish identities and founder and head of the Klal Yisrael project at Tel Aviv University. He received the 2009 Landau Prize for Life Achievement in Sociology. Ben-Rafael was chair of a committee appointed by the Cabinet of Israel to produce a series of recommendations on structuring a process by which those kibbutzim that so chose could transition to a more market-oriented economic model. He recently wrote Confronting Anti-Semitism in Europe, the Case of Belgian Jews, published by Brill in 2014. He will speak to us on a sociological perspective in today's anti-Semitism and strategies of confrontation. Excuse me for switching my seat to here for better hearing ability.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the organizers for this opportunity to address the plenary of this conference, very important conference. I will give some viewpoints that may be classified as sociological, but which are also at the same time historical. First, national societies are nowadays strongly marked by both transnational interconnectedness, resulting from economic, technological, and political processes, and by ethno-cultural heterogeneization of societies due to increasing movements of migration over the world. These processes created what can be called a multicultural, globalized world, a reality that experiences both some comfort but also acute tensions. In this latter respect, and it interests us especially, we may speak of xenophobia, racism, stereotypes, discrimination, and anti-Semitism, all different notions that describe conflictual relationships. Xenophobia means hostility toward people seen as not belonging. It targets outsiders carrying assumed noxious attributes. Racism valorizes or devalorizes biological genetic differences, setting groups on unequal footing. Stereotypes generalize a priori images of given categories of individuals. Discrimination signifies differential responses to different populations. Anti-Jewish sentiments, that is, anti-Semitism, belong to this set of notions. They can be traced back to Alexandria in the 3rd century, in narrations which ridiculize Jews' laws separating them from others in the city. Under the Romans, such antagonism came up to banning Jews from Rome because they refused to worship the emperor as God. Christianity still worsened the Jews' plight with theological condemnations justifying discriminations and persecutions and even massacres. Jews' suffering was supposed to remind them of the murder of Christ. Jews were here and there accused of blood libel, expelled from European countries. One example, Martin Luther, not Martin Luther King, was one of Jews' worst enemies. After Jews turned down his invitation to convert, to the reform, he spoke of them as venomous beasts, vipers, disgusting scums, devils incarnation. Russian Orthodoxy was hardly more compassionate. In the Islamic world, Jews and Christians were both classified as dhimmis, people of the book, and allowed to practice their religion. The golden age of Jewish culture in Spain came to an end, however, in the 11th century. It was terminated with pogroms. Though Cain and Goiten say that discrimination exerted by Muslims was often turned to non-Muslims in general and was not specifically anti-Jewish. Lewis supports this view only partially. He contends that Muslims always held negative stereotypes vis-à-vis Jews to not hatred until the 19th century. Later on, as the Zionist project unfolded, Islam became virulently anti-Jewish. In the meantime, in 1879, German Wilhelm Marr founded the League of Anti-Semitism and used the notion for the very first time. The notion insisted on the racial significance of Jewishness. He said, the Jews are the best children of the Christian state because this is their best interest. But their genuine interests are irreconcilable with Germany's. Echoing Richard Wagner, Jews, he stated, were a harmful slave race. This hatred of Jews was racist, no matter that Jews converted, changed professions, dressed like anybody. Its empirical basis was elaborated by the Russian Protocol of the Elder of Zion. Anti-Semitism at this epoch expanded to the Muslim world. The Damascus affair in 1840 and its following pogroms make up the turning point. The Jewish quarter in Fez was attacked by a mob in 1912. Similar events took place in Algeria, Iraq, and Libya. Wistrich contended that today's call for the destruction of Israel by Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, the Muslim Brotherhood represent a same mode of genocidal anti-Semitism. Though it is Europe that has for long remained the main scene of anti-Semitism. The Dreyfus Affair and the Baylis trial are points of reference, while on the other side of the Atlantic, between 19 and 1924, a resurgence of anti-Semitism followed the immigration of 2 million Jews from Eastern Europe. The lynch of Leo Frank, by a mob in Marietta, Georgia, in 1915, turned the spotlight on that anti-Semitism. The worst, of course, was still to come, with the Shoa by the Nazis, the decimation of European Jewry. At a different scale, efforts to eradicate the vitality of Jewry was common practice in the Soviet Union. The peak was the liquidation of Jewish intellectuals. While in a decline for some time after the Shoah in the rest of Europe, the Anti-Defamation League reports thousands of acts of anti-Semitism in the world per year. Harassment, intimidation, threats, or physical assaults. All these in spite of new efforts by the Catholic Church to promote more positive relations with the Jews. Vatican II published in 1965 Nostra Aetate that expunged texts taught in seminaries that legitimized the persecution of Judaism. Such efforts were short, however, to prevent the eruption of a new anti-Semitism a bit later. Sachs speaks of a genuine tsunami after the Six-Day War. For world opinion, the occupation of Palestinian territories prevented now Israel from positioning itself as a country of victims. Jews were, as proclaimed by de Gaulle, a people of conquerors. One more time, anti-Semitism was set free by top-down authorities. It rejoiced the ultra-nationalists all over Europe, whose cultures were and still is impregnated, even soaked, with anti-Semitism. An additional factor of European anti-Semitism has appeared in recent decades. The millions of new Europeans, that is, Muslim migrants, among them anti-Jewish organizations recruit followers. Hundreds of incidents at all degrees of gravity are now reported that target Jews and Jewish institutions. A phenomenon commonly called new anti-Semitism. Its peculiarity is its rising under the banner of anti-Zionism. It is boundless in its criticism of Israel and its demonization. Kotler underlines that while classical anti-Semitism consists in discriminating against Jews, the new anti-Semitism condemns the very embodiment of Jewishness in the Israeli state. The essence of this anti-Semitism consisting in assaulting whatever is defined as Jewish. But as Fischel shows, this new version is committed above all to the destruction of Israel and represents a coalition of extremist Muslims, anti-worldist leftists, opposed to Israel's policies, and right-wing anti-Jewish nationalists. These contentions, however, meet reserves on the side of no few scholars. Klug argues that people who support the Palestinians cannot be necessarily accused of anti-Semitism. For Zipperstein, a belief in Israel's responsibility for the conflict is part of what a reasonably informed, progressive, decent person thinks. Tariq Ali, a British Pakistani historian, says that speaking of new anti-Semitism subverts the language. Yet others, like Pierre-André Taguieff, evince that today anti-Semitism is not based anymore on racism and nationalism, but paradoxically enough, on anti-racism and anti-nationalism. It equals Zionism and racism, glorifies Holocaust denial, and borrows third worldism tokens. To be sure, in today Europe, Jews are not victims of institutional discrimination, but of bottom-up stigma, threats, nay, even physical violence. They are also victims of the media, which often take anti-Zionism for granted and fuel anti-Semitism indirectly. For large social circles, Jews as such are suspicious of support of Israel. And Israel is now a given of the public scene where harsh statements against it are common. One example among many, well-respected newspaper and public figures may advise Jews to avoid wearing the kippah in public, not to incite anti-Jewish reactions. At the same time, Israel is depicted as a criminal entity and condemning its imperious imperious attitude. The new Judeophobia blames the Jews in general for the so-called nationalism that is the assumed solidarity with Israel. Jews feel often obliged to add to their self-presentation in public as Jews when they are asked, "Are you of Jewish origin?" They may say, "Yes, I am a Jew, but I am against Israel." The defense of Palestinians erected in victims of Zionism legitimizes anti-Jewish violence as the revenge for Palestinian children killed by the Zionists, a theme that draws from the well-known ritual murder. Jean Genet, a respected writer, says one cannot be pro-Palestinian without being anti-Jewish. The BDS holds gatherings in many highly respected universities and other public premises. Its militants articulate the argument that Israel as a Zionist state is completely illegitimate. In brief, the demographic changes in the European population have given birth to a new Judeophobia that is gaining amplitude through a large spectrum of acts, targeting not only Israel-associated organs, but also just Jewish organizations. At a conceptual level, one may remind Zygmunt Bauman, who raised the notion of allosemitism. This notion was first coined by Arthur Sandauer, and it assesses that non-Jews attitudes toward Jews have always been radically different from the attitudes toward any other category of people. Close to allosemitism, proteophobia designates an object as not just unfamiliar, but in essence unfit to the general order of things, unrelatedly to time and space. It is a permanent interrogation. Where is this object from? What are its doings? Vis-à-vis Jews, says Bauman, allosemitism combines with proteophobia. Jews are an eternal object of negative reference, accounted for by the interplay of historical and cultural developments and actual circumstances. The combination of allosemitism and proteophobia focuses on Jewishness rather than Judaism. Even when Jews shave their beards to fit prevailing norms, they cannot kill anti-Semitism. As said by anti-Semite Rus, whatever Jews do, they retain the unique peculiarity. Bauman recalls Gombrowicz, for whom Jews' unnerving uniqueness goes back to centuries. A Jew represented already then the alienated man par excellence. Ever since, allosemitism is endemic to Western civilization as the embodiment of disorder. Bassi reminds the Jewish joke about anti-Semitism, according to which the Titanic catastrophe was caused by Jews. Iceberg is a Jewish name, isn't it? Anti-Jewish stereotypes are a plethora. A Christian who steals is a thief, of course. A Jew who steals is a Jewish thief. With the creation of Israel, the Jew was for a while on the side of anti-colonialism. Israelis then were often praised as different Jews. But after 1967, Jews stood again on the wrong side. When modernity erupted, Bauman pursues with Jacob Katz, emancipation opened the door to the pariah, successful assault on prestigious professions. Jews were people of inferior status who often moved up the social ladder and thus instilled in high spheres the fear of going down. This is openly claimed by Drummond, the French ideologist of anti-Semitism in France. In this Europe of nations, states and nation-states, Jews did not fit in, having only gypsies for company. Jews are dispersed, the epitome of incongruity, a non-national nation. Bauman quotes Hannah Arendt, reporting about German Jews exiles in France in the late 30s. We have been exemplary Germans. There is no reason we could not be exemplary Frenchmen. In the postmodern era, however, it is also Bauman's hypothesis that allosemitism is finally coming up to an end, as far as I can. Oh, thank you. Politics today, he says, is increasingly wrapped in identity conflicts rather than national or class contradictions. Ethnic differences are no more seen as temporary nuisance. Social life revolves around the establishment and protection of distinct identities. Hence, Jews cease to be special in this respect. Accusation of what the French call communautarism, that is, community self-closure, are now turned toward many groups. It was Bauman's conviction that in this new reality, anti-Semitism loses its specificity and therefore its equity. Though in actual facts, what we learn from Taguieff and many others invalidate this optimistic perspective. We must confess that allosemitism remains of actuality and continues to challenge Jews, notwithstanding the fact that other groups around are also accused of communautarism. The anti-Jewishness coming out from some of these other groups, together with veteran local milieu, does still give it special equity, to say the least. Thus, allosemitism can also be seen a perception by Jews of non-Jews' behavior with them, and not necessarily or only as an objective description of this behavior. This view of allosemitism is pertinent for analysts who are Jews themselves, which was the case of both Bauman and Sandauer. In other words, allosemitism may consist of a model of perception by Jews of how they are perceived by non-Jews. In this, allosemitism becomes a hypothesis pertinent to the study of how Jews interpret anti-Semitism. An hypothesis that asks if Jews do view anti-Semitism as a permanent given of their condition, or but as the outcome of circumstances that may be changed and evolve in one direction or another. From a historical viewpoint, we know that as victims of hatred, Jews displayed all over the centuries a varied gamut of reactions. Suicide, conversion to Christianism or Islam, emigration, embracing mysticism. Self-hatred is also often quoted, meaning that Jews finally accept that Jewishness is something bad by nature. Lessing shows the amplitude of this phenomenon among Jewish intellectuals at given epochs, a neurotic pattern of Jewish anti-Semitism. Gilman contends that one of the forms of this Jewish self-hatred is virulent opposition to Zionism and the existence of Israel. Wasserstein contends that many Jews have internalized elements of the anti-Semitic discourse and tend to surrender to it psychologically. A byproduct consists in self-distinction from other Jews. Jackson reminds how German Jews distinguished themselves from Ostjugend and how Southern France Jews asked the revolutionary... No, I cannot... 5 more minutes and I finish. Okay. Asked the revolutionary regime in Paris not to extend citizenship to Alsatian Jews. Hannah Arendt in her book Eichmann in Jerusalem described in disparaging colors Israelis assumedly moved by a thirst for revenge. I will skip, because of constraint of time, some strategic lines that could be proposed our Jews. But let's say that directly to the conclusion. Though most Jews today, it is to be confessed and emphasized, find a relative well-being and a condition favoring accomplishment in the diaspora Jewishness, and express it by sustaining and activating schools, museums, media, clubs, synagogues, institutes of many horizons. Jews also sustain bodies to respond on their behalf to anti-Semitism. All these, however, cannot obliterate the fact that even in this era, when numberless collective identities have become legitimate and call for recognition, Jews still appear as a kind of unicum. Jews are now possibly more able to stand anti-Semitism, but not to kill it. It's deemed that wherever you find Jews, you find some degree of allosemitism, maybe even where you do not find any Jew. Let me digress in order to conclude this final point, and remember a joke. Closing a recent French movie called Ils sont partout. They are everywhere. The last sequence of the movie shows the President of France explaining to his ministers the catastrophic situation of France. And he assesses that in France, among all elements of this society, only the Jews are prosperous and do well, thanks to their solidarity. He proposes that all French people convert to Judaism. In this manner, they will get wealthy, make friends, a solidaristic society, a solidaristic nation. The suggestion is endorsed unanimously by the ministers, and indeed, the national condition starts doing well. After 6 months, however, bombers coming from all horizons fly over France and bomb it. The iron law of allosemitism striking again. All in all, Jewish history has not come to an end yet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think everyone knows the hardest part of being a chair is asking people with wonderful things to say to give us a little time for discussion. So we have now some time for some comments or questions on the papers before we take the coffee break in, I think, 6 minutes. So if anybody would like to comment or ask questions, we thank Professor Ben-Rafael for being able to fit in time-wise.